Next presentation, Deconstructing the Perception of the Ego Self. We have the editor-in-chief of beinghuman.org. Please welcome Michael Taft.
Hi. So when I found out the name of this, or the theme of this conference was perception, I was particularly excited because I feel like a lot of times we get very, very theoretical at this conference. And by contrast, the theme of perception is very concrete and practical. And it's something that we can literally touch, right? It's tangibility, either through one sense organ or another. So we're going to talk about how the ego can be perceived as a sensory construct today. But first of all, I'd just like to read this quote by Sri Nisargadatta Maharaj. It's a little bit long, but it's worth listening to. He says, "There's no such thing as a person. There are only restrictions and limitations. The sum total of these restrictions and limitations defines the person. You think you know yourself when you know what you are, but you never know who you are, or you never know who you are. The person merely appears to be like the space within the pot, appears to have the shape and volume and smell of the pot." So in this case, what he's calling a person is what in the talk I'll be calling an ego or a self. So the main things we'll be talking about is how the ego can be, which we normally all experience as a subject, becomes an object, and how once the ego is perceived as an object, then you can see how that object is constructed. It's not a solid object, it's made of other smaller pieces. And as such, it can be deconstructed. And once the ego can be deconstructed, then we can experience freedom. And yet, since the ego is continuously reconstructing, it's never going to be taken apart in such a way that it breaks. It's simply perceived as something that can inherently construct and deconstruct. So even though we have freedom, we also have the function. We keep the ego function. So we'll go over all these points, but that's where I'm heading here today. So let's talk about how the ego as a subject becomes an object. So basically, your standard human being is identified with the experience of an ego. They believe that the ego is them, they are their ego, it's the same thing, right? That's what it means to say the ego is a subject. I am my ego. And the idea here is that we want to begin to see the ego as an object. Okay, it's like step one. And I wanted to make a nice visual metaphor for this change. This is a Bruegel painting called something like The Battle Between Christmas and Lent, or something like that. And you see it's very of the world, all the minutiae, there's every little tiny detail of village life in there. This is the ego as a subject, involved in all the minutiae, who likes me, who doesn't like me, who's judging me, whether I'm winning or losing at love, at work, at whether I'm healthy or unhealthy, my status and all this. This is what it's like to experience your ego as a subject. And this is, from the medieval period, but I could have taken pictures from almost any time up until about 1968, and they would have essentially been like this. But in the late 1960s and early 70s, we started getting some different kinds of pictures. And this is the famous one that was taken by the astronauts of Apollo 17 called the Blue Marble in 1972. And this radically shifted everyone's experience of the world. It went from all that minutiae of village life, or the minutiae even of a country or wars, and suddenly you could see it in a very different way. The entire world, the interconnectedness, the power of perspective, right? So being able to take that kind of self-identified, minute village life and suddenly get tremendous perspective on it changed everything. it changed it, in fact, from a subject into an object that we could then look at in the greater scheme of the universe. So that's what we're talking about here. And to further go into that, like how you look at the ego as an object rather than a subject, let's talk about what one is. Historically, sometimes people have talked about an ego self as an eternal spirit. This is the thing that when you die goes to heaven or gets judged by Anubis or gets reincarnated or whatever, right? That's one view of an ego self. Historically, there's also kind of the opposite view. The ego is the biggest problem there is. It's essentially the devil that is messing up your life and causing problems with everyone and making you act bad. As we move along in history, though, we get some definitions that are slightly more practical to work with. If you look at analysis, Freud would, in a nutshell, say that the ego was the sum total of your psychological defenses. So all your armoredness and every experience of your life and all your pain and suffering has sort of built up this kind of system of defenses against the world, and that's your ego. But as the thinking of Darwin and evolutionary psychology has moved forward, we can think of the ego as something that evolved for a reason. And that gives us something we can work with a little more powerfully and practically, which is that the ego is an evolved, brain-generated, imaginary entity. So it's essentially a story you're telling yourself in your head about who you are. But let's look very deeply at what we mean by an evolved, brain-generated, imaginary entity. And this will let us look at the ego as a sensory experience. Right? This is the important part and why it comes into being about perception. Because with the first two definitions, that we saw historically, the eternal spirit or the kind of devil or problem in your life, the ego was something that was very hard to get a hold of, right? You couldn't point at it. You could say, I feel one, I know it's there, but it's very hard to get a handle on it. And people tried various methods to get a handle on it, such as let's break the ego down into the elements, fire, earth, water, air, and meditate on it that way. But that's still kind of conceptual. It's hard to sit there and meditate on the water in your body as opposed to the earth in your body. It's really a concept that you're juggling. And then there's the skandha system, which is really advanced, but still some parts of the Buddhist skandha system, such as samskaras, are really hard to meditate on or to notice. I've literally maybe never met someone who said they could successfully sit there and meditate on a skandha, on a samskara, I mean. It's very hard. So how can we notice the sensory experience of this brain-generated hallucination? Another way of asking this, so that we can perceive it as an object. Another way of asking this is, how do you know you are there? So let's look into that. How do you know that you exist as a person? Anyone want to venture some guesses?
You can reach over and pinch yourself.
Right, so you reach over and pinch yourself. That's a sensory experience, right? You're having a body sensation. So the fact that you're perceiving that body sensation lets you know you're there. What other possibilities are there?
By perceiving other people, I see them in relation to myself.
Right, so your eyes pick up other people. That's a sensory experience. Same thing, now you know you're there. So those are two sort of kind of concrete physical ones. What are some other possibilities?
Through the witnessing experience, through dreaming and sleeping and waking consciousness.
Right, so that's an interesting example. We're going to get there, but that's actually looking at something a little further. Yes?
I am the one that is having the perceptions.
Yes, you guys are all good non-dualists, so you're jumping sort of to the end of the thing. But let's talk about this. So the main ones that we heard here were physical sensation ones, but there's also thinking, right? René Descartes, so I think, therefore I am. thoughts are happening. And even though we're not used to thinking of thoughts as sensory experiences, they are things that you are listening to or seeing with your mind. Right?
They're intangible, whereas this is tangible.
Yeah, and yet they are functionally related. You can see thoughts as pictures in your mind's eye, the imagination, that's part of thinking. So that's going on, that helps us know we're there. You can have verbal thoughts, the stream of unconsciousness, as I like to call it, self-talk, inner dialogue. And so these are intangible sensory experiences that are letting you know you're there. And then there's the other kind we just talked about, body sensations like pinching yourself, or feeling, your feet on the floor, or emotional type body sensations. So you're happy or sad, and you feel, the accelerated heartbeat, or flushness in your face, or the smile of joy on your face, something like that. So these various types of thoughts and body sensations or feelings are sort of the menu of things that are being perceived that let you know you're there. Okay? So this is all pretty obvious so far, right? Where it gets sort of interesting is that the thoughts and feelings don't stay separated in a nice list like that. They come together and tangle together and into an indistinguishable ball of experience. And we call that an ego. So there's a lot of stuff in there. There's a lot of self-referential memory. There's a lot of interacting with other people. There's a lot of various types of sensations, the feeling of your heartbeat, a memory or an emotional feeling about something that happened last night. But all of that's coming together moment by moment to kind of fuse together into this experience that we're not paying a whole lot of attention to, the details of. It's just there, and it seems solid, and it seems real, and we call it me, right? And in fact, we reify it. It's not just me, it's an entity, and it might even be an eternal entity, depending on our model. But really, and when it comes together, it looks more like that than like that. That's sort of an easy diagram, but the feeling is more like, a lot of stuff coming together into this very powerful, fused, real feeling experience. Feels very, very real. But I guarantee you, there's no person in there. Okay? It just is a whole bunch of sensory experiences coming together into this fused ball that you're calling you. So what do you do about it? Or why does that matter? Well, something that's constructed like that can be deconstructed. Right? We know it's made of pieces. At least the way I've just talked about it, it's made of these streams of sensory experience. And when the fact that those all come together into a lattice or a mesh means that you can pull that apart. Okay, so that gives us a lot of practical power. Now we're not talking about some kind of metaphysical entity that we have to have a metaphysical experience of, or do something spiritually difficult with. We're talking about direct sensory experience, as real as touching this chair, that we can just tease apart in a very careful manner. And when you do this, it goes back to, when you do this to an ego, when you deconstruct it, it goes back to its constituent pieces. And it's perceived or experienced as a process of ever-changing sensations. Right? So it doesn't have to be seen as a nondescript, fused ball called me. In fact, it starts being seen as the opposite of me. It starts being seen as, wow, there's some emotion in there right now, and there's some talk, and there's some pictures, and there's some external experience, and all that's kind of coming together. And it's interesting in a bunch of ways. One of which is that an object can't be a subject. So when you are perceiving the ego in this way, it's very likely that you will disidentify with it. So that habit of making it me, of reifying it into a thing, gets trained out of you. because instead of constantly identifying with it in an unconscious way, consciously you're noticing it, and that turns it from a subject into an object, meaning it's no longer you, it's something you observe. So that becomes pretty interesting. And of course, as you guys know, the question then becomes, who's noticing that? Who's looking at these sensations? And we can call that a bunch of different words, but awareness is noticing the sensations, right? And yes. Oh, 5 minutes. Okay, good. And awareness is not made of those sensations. There's, debate about whether it can only arise with sensations or not, and or whether it's, pure awareness in some sense, or whether it comes from outside the physical biological organism or not. But the point being, the thing that's noticing the sensations is not the sensations. Okay, so what I would minimally say is it's the evolved biological organism, the brain, that is noticing its own self-generated hallucination. In evolution, this hallucination called me, called the self, is very useful. It allows you to get stuff done. You wouldn't actually want to get rid of one in a permanent way. That would, cause you a lot of trouble. Namely psychosis, and but it's very good to be able to notice one deconstructing and reconstructing moment by moment. Because the way I've talked about it, it sort of sounds like you're going to sit there and notice this, deconstructing, and that's it. Whereas actually, it's an iterative process over and over and over of noticing the slow accretion and conglomeration and fusion of sensory perceptions into a indistinguishable ball of ego, and then that same ball falling slowly apart into its constituent perceptual strands over and over and over again. And that in itself is a very interesting thing to pay attention to. And it gives rise to a very powerful perception, a very powerful realization that's characterized by my friend, the philosopher Thomas Metzinger, by the sentence, nobody ever had or was a self. A self is a function in the brain software that perception can either not pay that much attention to, which is kind of the biological default. It's there to help us do what we need to do all day long. But if we let it stay in its default mode like that, it can cause some trouble, as we all know. So by turning the perception onto the ego as an object, we can notice that it's not an entity, it's not us, it's not a solid thing, it's made of pieces. And that is a very important thing to notice and very helpful. And it leads to a further awareness, which is that our perception of the external world, rather than the ego, can be deconstructed in exactly the same way. The picture you have of all the people in the room around you right now is a brain-generated construction that's arriving in perception. It's not the room, it's not the people in the room, it's a movie you're watching in your mind of sensory data that's coming from the room. And so this external world sensory data can also be deconstructed in exactly the same way as the ego. So that it goes from a freedom from subject-object dualism inside the person, which is one level of waking up, to a freedom from subject-object dualism in between the person and the entire world, which is a whole other level of waking up. So with that, I'd just like to ask if there's any questions. Yes?
Where can we find out information about the deconstruction process that you're speaking of. Is that on your website?
Yeah, so I talk a lot about it on my website, which I'll show the address here, deconstructingyourself.com. And also the Buddhist teacher Shinzen Young has a lot of material about this.
Do you think it's possible that just the sort of the idea or the experience of observation itself could also just fall in that category of sensations as part of the ego?
So can you observe the awareness as a sensation? Is that what you're asking?
Right. I mean, is that itself just part of the ego and not like some other thing?
That may be like a hall of mirrors, infinite regression question, but the easy answer is probably not. Anybody else? Yeah.
How would enlightenment's ego be different from unenlightenment's ego? Enlightenment's ego, how would that be different from unenlightenment's ego?
So, first of all, you're saying it in a black-white kind of way, and it's more of a gradation, right? But just we'll speak about it in a really black and white kind of way, which is really rare. But the difference is that the enlightened ego is never perceived as a solid entity or as some kind of reified object. It's a stream of sensation. So it's still completely functioning, still useful in the world. It does everything an ego does, but it's a flowing, supple ego that's not ever solidifying. It's like the difference between ice and water. It becomes water, metaphorically.
Can you briefly comment on the states that you have experienced that lead you to this formulation, which I agree with? My understanding of what you've been talking about came as a result of states of consciousness, which were very separate, and which first dropped out the somatic self, which is the physical bodily self.
Yes.
A lot of which is in the parietal lobe. And then dropping out the psychic sense of self, which is the possessive, intrusive, intangible self, which is another way of using the same words I think that you were using.
Yeah.
You have some, I gather, some personal experience with states
Yes.
that have led you to this thesis.
Right.
Could you briefly tell us about that?
Yeah, the easiest one to talk about is what I was describing as noticing the wave of the self coming together and falling apart over and over again. By doing meditative techniques on the various pieces of the self, like, or the ego, like just meditating on mental talk, or just meditating on mental image, or then meditating on them together, just meditating on body sensation, a lot of meditating on emotional body sensation, over and over and over, to see those individual things. It's like, metaphorically, it's like instead of hearing a band, you get really trained at hearing the drums or the bass or the guitar or the vocals, so that when they're playing together, you can hear the individual instruments. Then when you hear the whole band playing, after a lot of training like that, you can track all the individual instruments at once. And so that leads to the experience of watching this very interesting wave that occurs of the ego coming together and falling apart and coming together and falling apart, which makes it very hard to imagine that's you, or that it's somehow a solid thing. And then, of course, in those moments when it's falling apart or all the way apart, there's tremendous spaciousness. And then eventually over time, even when it comes together, that's happening in tremendous spaciousness. So that's...
Any particular style of meditation that you've been following? Particular tradition?
I did a tremendous amount of Hindu meditation, and then worked with Shinzen Young with his sort of very three-vehicle Buddhist Vipassana conglomeration that he's come up with. So this this way of breaking it down, the exact system I used is from Shinzen. And so that's, I know for a fact, very effective.
Question, why does the question is, does the ego have to construct and deconstruct? Why does it go through intervals where it has to fall apart? What's the reason behind that? In life, your ego construct and deconstruct several times.
It might just be some kind of artifact of perceiving the ego. I mean, maybe we know that, for example, it falls apart while you're asleep, right? You don't have much of an ego while you're in deep sleep, and there's very little in a dream. So there's bigger cycles of that wave. But it just sort of feels that way when you're perceiving it. I wouldn't claim that it's actually doing that. You know, the strands of sensory experience may be continuous, but it's the subjective experience of it is sort of this thing that comes together and falls apart. So I'm not sure that that's verifiable as with neural correlates or something. All right, thank you.
Sergio here?